There is a liquid that costs about $3, and if you brush it onto rusted metal, something strange happens. Not slowly over months, not gradually over years, almost immediately. The orange corrosion you thought was destroying your steel begins turning dark, almost black, as if the metal itself is healing. Within an hour, the rust at once spread like a disease across your tools, your vehicle frame, or your outdoor gear becomes something completely different. Stable, solid, sealed. It no longer flakes, no longer grows, no longer eats the metal underneath. It simply stops. And here's the part that makes people pause for a moment. This isn't some futuristic laboratory breakthrough. It isn't a new chemical invented last year. It's not something you need a mechanic, a shop, or a special certification to apply. In fact, humans have known about this reaction for nearly 2,000 years. Long before factories, long before dealerships, long before the global auto parts industry turned rust into a billion-dollar problem, and people were already quietly solving it. Blacksmiths used it on iron tools before the winter rains came. Shipbuilders treated metal fittings with it before long sea voyages. Even military engineers once relied on the exact same chemistry to preserve steel in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Today, you can still buy the raw compound for the price of a cup of coffee, and yet almost nobody talks about it. If you've ever spent money replacing rusted tools, rusted brake lines, rusted exhaust parts, or rusted gear that should have lasted another decade, you might want to stay with me for a few minutes, because the story behind this simple $3 liquid is not just about chemistry. It's about forgotten knowledge, quiet suppression, and a solution that was never supposed to stay this cheap. And if you're the kind of person who enjoys uncovering things like this, the kind of hidden knowledge that somehow slips through the cracks of modern industry, you might feel strangely at home here. If that's you, maybe consider subscribing. Not because a channel asked you to, but because the more people who keep these conversations alive, the harder it becomes for knowledge like this to disappear. Now let me show you where this story really begins. About 2,000 years ago, long before anyone used the word rust converter, for most of human history, rust wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a serious threat to survival. Iron tools represented months of work, rare resources, and in many cases the difference between a successful harvest and starvation. When iron rusted away, replacing it wasn't as simple as visiting a hardware store. Entire communities depended on keeping their metal tools alive as long as possible. And that's where an accidental discovery began changing everything. In ancient leather workshops, long before modern chemistry had a name for it, craftsmen soaked animal hides in large vats filled with water and crushed tree bark. Oak bark, chestnut bark, and certain fruits were especially valuable for this process. The water in these vats slowly turned dark brown as natural plant compounds leached out of the wood and soaked into the broop. Hides. The process strengthened the leather and made it durable enough for armor, sandals, belts, and saddles. But something unusual kept happening inside those vats. Iron tools that accidentally fell into the tanning solution stopped rusting. Knives left overnight in the mixture came out darker but strangely protected. Metal hooks, buckles, and blades developed a thin black surface that resisted corrosion even when exposed to damp air. Afterward, at first it probably seemed like a coincidence, but craftsmen noticed patterns, and once enough tools came out of those vats rust-free, word began spreading quietly from workshop to workshop. Leather workers told blacksmiths, and blacksmiths told soldiers. Soldiers told the people responsible for maintaining weapons on long campaigns. Before long, iron tools were being intentionally dipped into bark-rich solutions before storage. No one knew the chemistry behind it yet. They only knew it worked. And if you pause for a moment and imagine those workshops, dim light, smoke in the air, iron tools hanging on wooden walls, it's fascinating to realize that people were discovering corrosion chemistry through simple observation, not through expensive research facilities, just by paying attention to what nature was already doing. Sometimes I think about that when modern problems feel complicated. A lot of solutions were discovered by people who simply noticed something unusual and asked, why does that happen? If this kind of story fascinates you the way it fascinates me, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read a lot of them late at night, and it's always surprising to see how far these conversations travel. But the discovery didn't stay inside leather workshops for long. Because once metalworkers realized what was happening, they began experimenting. And what they uncovered eventually became one of the most powerful rust-stopping reactions ever discovered. The secret was hidden in the bark itself. Inside oak, chestnut, tea leaves, grape skins, and dozens of other plants lives a natural compound called tannin. When extracted and concentrated, it forms something called tannic acid. This molecule has a remarkable property. It reacts directly with iron oxide, the reddish corrosion we call rust, and chemically transforms it into a different substance. Instead of flaky, expanding rust, the metal surface converts into a stable compound called iron tannate. Iron tannate is dark, almost black in color. More importantly, it doesn't dissolve in water. It doesn't expand like rust. It bonds tightly to the metal beneath it and forms a barrier that slows or stops further. Corrosion, in simple terms, it doesn't cover rust, and it transforms it, and that difference matters. Most modern rust treatments are coatings. They sit on top of the problem. If moisture gets underneath the coating, corrosion begins again. But tannic acid works differently. It changes the rust itself into a protective layer that clings directly to the steel surface. The disease becomes liqueur. By the time early naval engineers and metalworkers began documenting corrosion problems, centuries later, this reaction was already quietly known among craftsmen in coastal shipyards. Metal fittings exposed to salt air were sometimes treated with tannin-rich extracts before installation. Toolmakers dipped blades into plant solutions before storage. It wasn't perfect science yet, but the pattern was undeniable. Metal treated this way lasted longer, much longer. Fast forward to the early 19th century, when chemistry was finally becoming a formal scientific discipline. European researchers studying plant compounds began isolating tannic acid as a pure substance. When scientists tested it against rusted iron, they confirmed what blacksmiths had observed for generations. The reaction was powerful. When tannic acid met iron oxide, the transformation into iron tannate happened almost immediately. And suddenly something interesting happened. A traditional craft technique turned into measurable chemistry. Once laboratory testing confirmed the reaction, industries began experimenting with it. Naval engineers, bridge builders, and early railroad maintenance crews all explored tannin-based treatments as a way to slow corrosion on iron infrastructure. For a time, it seemed possible that rust might actually become a manageable problem. But then the 20th century arrived, and with it came something that changed the entire equation. Industrial-scale manufacturing. As global industries expanded, corrosion turned into something very different, a recurring revenue stream. Cars, trucks, machinery, and tools were now produced by the millions, and with that scale came a strange economic reality. Rust didn't just destroy metal, it drove replacement. Entire sectors of the automotive industry quietly benefited from parts that corroded over time. Exhaust systems, brake lines, suspension components, body panels. Corrosion meant customers eventually needed new ones. Rust prevention products became another profitable category, often requiring repeated applications year after year. Think about that for a moment. If a solution existed that permanently stopped rust for a few dollars, it wouldn't fit neatly into that system. That doesn't mean there was a dramatic conspiracy meeting in some boardroom where executives decided to hide the truth. Real life rarely works that way. Suppression is usually quieter. Cheaper solutions simply fade into obscurity, while more profitable products receive advertising, branding, and shelf space. Meanwhile, the original chemistry remains quietly available to anyone curious enough to look for it. And that brings us to the part that surprises most people. Because the solution still exists, and using it is almost ridiculously simple. Tannic acid powder is widely available from chemical suppliers, woodworking suppliers, and even some food processing vendors. It's inexpensive because the compound occurs naturally in plants and doesn't require complex manufacturing to create a rust conversion solution. The mixture is simple. Dissolve a small amount of tannic acid powder in warm water until the liquid turns the color of strong tea. That's it. No complicated equipment, no solvents, no specialized training. Once mixed, the solution can be brushed or sprayed directly onto rusted metal. Before applying it, loose, flaky rust should be brushed away so the liquid can reach the surface beneath. You don't need to grind the metal shiny. In fact, the reaction works best when rust is still present for the compound to convert. When the solution touches rust, the change often becomes visible within minutes. The orange surface begins darkening. Gradually it shifts toward deep blue-black. What you're seeing in that moment is the molecular transformation from iron oxide into iron tannate. The unstable corrosion layer is becoming something dense and stable, And after drying, the treated surface can be painted, oiled, waxed, or coated like any other piece of metal. And the remarkable part is that the converted surface actually holds paint better than bare polished steel. The microscopic texture of iron tannate creates a stronger bond for protective coatings. In other words, the rust you thought was ruining your metal becomes the anchor point for protecting it. When I first learned about this reaction years ago, I remember testing it on an old rusted tool just to see if it really worked. Watching that bright orange corrosion slowly turn dark and stable felt strangely satisfying. Like seeing a problem reverse itself. If you ever tried something like this yourself, I'd honestly love to hear about it. Leave a comment and tell me what piece of metal you'd try it on first. A tool? A vehicle frame? Maybe an old cast iron pan? It's always interesting seeing the different ways people put old knowledge back into practice, because that's really what the story's about. Not secret chemicals, not industry conspiracies, just knowledge that slowly slipped out of everyday conversation. Rust still destroys billions of dollars of equipment every year. Tools get thrown away, vehicle parts get replaced, outdoor gear gets scrapped. Often because corrosion slowly wins the battle. But sometimes the solution was never lost. It was simply forgotten. And the next time you see rust creeping across a piece of metal you care about, you might remember that a simple reaction discovered centuries ago can still change what happens next. $3, a little patience, and chemistry that never stopped working.